Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the afternoon portion of the First Gen Student Support Summit. My name is Denise Poole, and I'm Director of Student Success Initiatives overseeing the Student Success Center, who is sponsoring today's summit. Today, I have the distinct opportunity of introducing our afternoon keynote, Dr. Jerod Stapleton. But before I do, I have a few announcements. Jerod, welcome with us, but just a few announcements before I get started. And so while all of our attendees, while all of you are enjoying our summit this afternoon, I would like to remind you that there are several great ways to interact with our fellow summit participants and our greater community through Whova. So we encourage you to provide feedback for this session through the chat and Q&A as we progress. But also, if you attended early morning sessions, it's important for us to get additional feedback. So please go back when you get a minute and go to the Whova app to fill out our session evaluations. All materials regarding today's sessions and all sessions throughout the day are available in the Whova app under the session details, and they'll be available for you for the next 3 months. So you can revisit, return, watch recordings of all sessions, and view materials. So just a reminder, please, if you would rather go through another screen on your desktop to go to Whova, that's fine. Some of you have downloaded the Whova app. Sometimes it's easier to pop those questions for your speakers in through your handheld device or mobile device and use the chat that way. But there's a lot of activity going on, so please don't miss out and be a part of that activity as we move forward. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce our afternoon keynote speaker, Dr. Jerod Stapleton. Dr. Stapleton is an associate professor of health, behavior, and society in the College of Public Health at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Stapleton's leadership roles include serving as co-leader of the Cancer Prevention and Control Program at the Markey Cancer Center and acting department chair in HBS. Dr. Stapleton is a first-generation college student who grew up in a small town in Appalachia, Ohio. He completed his undergrad training at East Tennessee State University and obtained his Ph.D. in biobehavioral health from Penn State University in 2010. Dr. Stapleton is a prevention scientist with an expertise and research interests that include conducting qualitative and quantitative, I'm going to mispronounce this, I'm sorry, etiological studies and better understand health behavior through the lens of a variety of behavioral and decision-making theories. Through applying etiological insights and prevention science principles to the design and evaluation of behavioral interventions and utilizing digital platforms for the delivering of behavioral interventions. He has sustained history at NIH research funding and over 80 peer-reviewed publications. Dr. Stapleton is an internationally recognized leader in the field of skin cancer and melanoma prevention research, and his studies have been cited by the World Health Organization and U.S. Preventative Service Task Force and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That was a lot, but we are thrilled to have you, Dr. Stapleton, with us today. Thank you for joining us. I will now hand the Zoom room over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak at the summit here. As you mentioned, I got my doctorate at Penn State, which was a tremendous experience. So, I'm very grateful and humbled to be invited back. So thank you. All right, I'm going to do my share screen thing here and then make this the presenter mode here. Okay. All right. Are you seeing my notes now? Someone let me know if that works.
We're just seeing your slides. You're good.
Yeah, good. Okay, slides. Thank you so much. Okay, great. So I want to tell you a little bit about my experience growing up. So I grew up in a small town in Ohio, right on the river called Gallipolis. And I lived a pretty carefree existence, I would say, on a very vibrant neighborhood street with a lot of friends my age around, and spent a lot of time every day playing out in the woods. And doing things like that. So it's sort of like Tom Sawyer meets the 1990s, but the adventures weren't quite nearly that exciting. But it was clear to me from a very young age that there were some limitations growing up in my town. So Some of these were economic, and so there are a lot of low educational rates. Some of the larger employers were very unstable, and would, shut their doors for months at a time, only to open again and be bought out. And it was also a place where, as a kid who, was a bit of a smarty pants, admittedly, asked a lot of questions of adults, probably had a little bit of sort of oppositional tendencies. It was a place where that wasn't exactly appreciated. And so, and I also didn't have a lot of insights or experience in seeing what professional worlds were like. My parents went to work from 9 to 5 and came home. So, it was a place that had a lot of opportunities, but also I think as I reflect back, some challenges that way. So here's some pictures of my town, and I put this one in the middle here of me in this chair. My 10-year-old daughter thinks that one's hilarious. So being a first generation student, it's always something that I've thought about in terms of how it shaped my path. And I've also mentored students that are first generation college students, and I've had project staff on my research projects that I've managed, and they're first generation college students also. So I've worked really hard at thinking about, some strategies and ways to, think how that's impacted me in the past and how it's impacting those folks I'm interacting with on a day-to-day basis. And now being at the University of Kentucky, I see a lot of students on campus that have had a very similar experience in terms of growing up in areas around like near where I did, and being first generation college students. So I've thought even more about this. But the one thing that happened a few years ago that really made me excited and happy to see that some of this attention was being to first generation college students, was extending past college campuses, was this 2019 statement from the National Institutes of Health. So if you don't know what the National Institutes of Health are, that's the NIH. It's a really big, important a group for scientists such as myself. They fund much of our research, and they also effectively set a lot of training priorities for the scientific workforce in the U.S. So these guidelines, state the importance of diversity to ensuring that the United States remains a scientific global leader. And there's research to support the fact that when you have teams that are made of heterogeneous teams with people with different backgrounds and perspectives, that the research is better, that the collaborations are stronger, and you get just a better product. But what really struck me about this particular guideline was NIH's definition of what it is to be an underrepresented population. And so I'm a public health researcher. And so, it's not surprising for me to see listed on here racial and ethnic minorities, women, individuals with disabilities. These are groups for which there are well-documented disparities in educational opportunities. I was a little surprised and also very encouraged to see explicitly called out the attention to individuals from a disadvantaged background. And if we look at how that was defined and what NIH was saying about that, is they provided this list, and they said anyone who meets two of these, and I've edited this down, by the way, for ease of presentation, but anyone who meets two of these criteria is defined as coming from a background that's disadvantaged in terms of representation in the scientific workforce. And the first thing I noticed is that I did indeed meet two of these criteria, being a first generation college student and growing up in a rural area, and also an area that was both rural and low income. And, I've thought a lot about my experience over the years, but this was something that really, gave me pause and made me think a lot about viewing my successes in terms of making it into the scientific workforce, but also some of the challenges I had along the way from the lens of someone, from such a background. And I do want to say and be honest that I still struggle a little bit in terms of what it truly means and continues to me in terms of having this background. So, on one hand, in my own hometown, I knew people, even relatives, who were, dealing with things like housing and food insecurity. And, I lived a very comfortable life relative to the space and time where I lived. I didn't feel disadvantaged in my hometown. And I've also felt a little bit, I know I've benefited from multiple privileges, and it's always made me a little uncomfortable lumping in my experience as being disadvantaged, knowing that others experience a type of structural racism and discrimination that literally takes years off people's lives. So I do think it's important to know that. I think a little bit about some first generation college students and people thinking about this may struggle a little bit with what that means to them. And, that's always something that I think about a lot about too. But I do think, on the other hand, that I do agree with NIH that we do need to ensure that we have participation. That's the phrase I keep going back to, enhancing participation from these groups in the workforce. And I think that when I think about that, I do reflect on some challenges I had that I do think were associated with being a first generation college student who didn't have a lot of educational opportunities. Some of these were relatively minor, but I did have a few things that did almost derail me from my career. And so there were a select group of people who really, took a chance on me and helped me make it through there. So I just wanted to say that, I'm not planning on telling the story of every first generation student, or this is not evidence-based sort of advice. And when I get into, I'm telling my personal story with the hopes of, raising awareness and understanding, if you have individuals with shared experience, maybe that will impact sort of the way you think about this. So I think the challenge here to fulfill this mission is to really ensure that individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds or first generation students are given chances and then learn the skills to actually take advantage of these chances when given them. So I was trying to think about the best way to kind of frame this conversation and how I think about this. And so I think that I came up with this idea of sort of a map with holes in it. And I couldn't find a map with holes all over it. So you'll have to use this map, which is a few holes, and imagine there are more holes. But anyway, I think a lot of first generation college students like myself, they're put in a position where they have this mindset of, you're going to college, you're a smart kid. That's what's happening. And so I've always had this upward growth mentality, right? I know that I'm going somewhere. It was never a question that I was going to go to college, but that's sort of like having a bit of a map, like a map with the holes in it. So, the general direction, where that X is that you're headed, but along the way, there are things that come up that you're not expecting, you didn't see, obstacles that you may not really know how to deal with, or have those professional models or images in your mind of what that means and how you've seen other people deal with things like that. So I think that first generation students often find ways to address problems that really do help them be successful, but also sometimes can be a little maladaptive or come across in a way that others don't quite understand. And so that's the sort of thinking that I had in preparing the rest of this presentation, is talk a little bit about some of those things that I think first generation students bring to the table, but may not always be appreciated. So I did mention the fact that I think if, coming at this from a lens of, scientific workforce training professionals in science, but really in any other space, the first thing is that you really have to have a chance. And so I think every part of my educational experience, someone gave me a chance and, I took it, and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that. So I first attended East Tennessee State University as an undergrad. That was a small sort of commuter campus college. I did struggle a little bit with the transition to college, mostly because of procrastination. Being a smart kid, I did a lot of things last minute, and that was fine. That certainly caught up to me at some point in college when I had a term paper due, and I started the night before, like I've done many, many times. But this was in the early 2000s. There wasn't a ton of internet resources, and I just couldn't find any information about the person I was supposed to be writing about. I ended up failing the paper and the class. And so needless to say, my college experience did not start out swimmingly. My GPA was really bad, but around my junior year, I decided I wanted to go into research. I wanted to become a scientist. I was really excited about the idea. And so there was a professor in my department named Joel Hillhouse, who basically ignored every red flag about me, and based on the fact that I was so enthusiastic about wanting to do this work, and gave me a chance in his lab. And so to work in his lab, it's a startup lab. So for me, it was really exciting. And that put me on my career path. I quickly became the leader of that lab and gained a tremendous amount of experience. I graduated in 2004 and stuck around for an extra year of a master's program. And then Dr. Hillhouse's colleague, Dr. Rob Teresi there at Penn State, was asking colleagues for students, and Dr. Hillhouse at ETSU mentioned me. At that point, I'd done really, really well on my grades after that, but my GPA was not great. My GREs were just good enough to sort of eke in. But those recommendations, my strong track record, really got me into Penn State. So I'm really grateful for the fact that even though on paper, again, I didn't look like the typical grad student, Dr. Teresi and Penn State and biobehavioral health, were willing to take a chance on me. And then at Penn State, I had a lot of great experiences. I took advantage of every opportunity again. And was able to make that into a position at Rutgers, where I started in 2011. Again, being a first generation college student, I'll talk about this in a little bit. I left Penn State with a ton of experience, but a little bit of a less focus than maybe I could have. And so rather going the traditional sort of postdoc route, I took my first assistant professor position. And again, I think a lot of that was the person who hired me at the time, Dr. Sharon Manning, who became a really vital mentor to me, knew that I had a lot of the skill set and a drive to make that happen. And so again, knowing that, trusting in my dedication and my background and making that work, and it did. And the same thing happened when I interviewed for a faculty position at University of Kentucky. Again, not having a lot of leadership experience, but being very enthusiastic and energetic about it, and offered some administrative positions, and which have turned out really, really well for me. And UK has been a great place that way. So again, I've been really appreciative for everyone along the way. I just want to make sure that people are thinking about that way, and some first generation students may not look like the typical student that or person that you may be selecting for things like this. So in the last 8 minutes or so that I have, I started to think a little bit about what are some of the things that I've heard people say about me or heard said about other first generation college students, and how do those consistent or different with sort of how I view myself. And what's going on there, because I definitely see a lot of these things. And then maybe talking a little bit about some of the considerations for people who are maybe training or helping to lead first generation college students, and what they may think about doing to help with some of these things. So I've heard been said about myself a few times that, I'm sort of rough around the edges or raw or things like that. And others have said that about me, but I've always considered myself to be very excited and enthusiastic and very confident, but also in certain uncertain, some important moments. And I think a lot of this stems from the fact that if you think about the first generation college student experience, most of us have very little professional experience. Contrast with my daughter, who was on a recruitment dinner with the cancer center director and other higher up administrators when she was 6 years old, when I was being recruited at the University of Kentucky. I mean, it's totally a different night and day kind of experience. And you can see in my young daughters that they get it, right? They behave a certain way. They don't say the same kind of things. For me, I've never had an experience like that prior to, we're actually really going to graduate school. The first time I got on a flight was to fly to graduate school. And fortunately, I was flying from a small airport to a small airport, had no issues with with making my connection. But, I just had a flight that was a disaster a couple of weeks ago the fact that I've flown so much was easy for me to deal with. But, those are the kind of things that maybe people don't think about so much, right? Just the flight itself to get somewhere, or the traveling there is difficult. How to dress, never having really chose a business suit. I think I bought a suit for a funeral at one point in time. But these are all new experiences. And I think that in some ways, this is helpful. I've always sort of been oddly empowered. I've always said that I don't know enough to be afraid or nervous sometimes. So I've often find myself talking to people at conferences or going up to people and having up conversations. And then after the fact, people being like, I can't believe you talked to that person, or like, that kind of thing. So it's definitely empowering in some ways, but I also think this is challenging. So I think a lot of what we want to think about is providing opportunities to learn these professional skills in low stakes settings. I think my orientation to my PhD program was a little bit of an anxiety-provoking experience because I didn't know what to expect. And then I was thinking about the fact that we went bowling afterwards. And I was sort of thinking if we'd have flip-flopped that, maybe, bowling, those connections first before professional settings. I think these are the kind of things that we can do to get, first-generation college students more comfortable in situations like that. Just being aware of these differences in experiencing, finding ways that allow people to connect through activities like that. And I think, what are some things that are personal differences versus inexperience? So, I hear people say things like, I'm nervous, and some people are nervous speakers, and that's fine. But some of those things are inexperience. So I think a lot of things we sort of accept as, that's fine. You're not comfortable doing that. But sometimes I think it's a lack of experience. And we really need to think about ways to give individuals experiences to act in a professional kind of way. For the next one, I think, people have seen me sometimes as sort of being scattered and inconsistent, I think. And I see myself as very driven to take every opportunity. And I think what is really underlying some of this is a lot of first generation students are sort of living that traditional, American dream. It's going to be better for you than it was for your parents. You're going to college. They didn't go to college. You're going onward and upward. And I think as part of that, you're very eager to take every single opportunity that's presented, because a lot of them are exciting and new. And I also think you have a very strong obligation especially if you're growing up in a more traditional sort of a household of, you keep your word and you perform at a really high level, regardless of what the commitment is and how important it is, or if things change. And I think, being driven has been a huge part of my success and trying to take every opportunity. But I know that sometimes that backfires a bit. So one thing that I was thinking about here, being at Penn State was like being a kid at the candy store. I mean, there were all these courses I wanted to take. I was in a very productive research labs. There were always papers I could write, or analyses I could write, or projects I could help with, or new courses to take. And so I left grad school with a pretty strong on paper record, but also not necessarily feeling that I had carved myself out. And there were some self-management skills and really just basic management skills and planning skills that I didn't really have a chance to develop because I was doing so many other things. And so I think, looking back now, I'm having a little bit of a restraint to know that an opportunity is there, but you don't necessarily have to take it. Slow myself down a little bit, engage in some of those more planning strategy kind of activities would have been helpful for me. So I think it's important that we provide that context for students. This is what an opportunity is, and provide options to explore things, in kind of low stakes kind of way. Because I think that once students do commit to things, first generation students, they're very eager to finish them. And I think the other part of this is that success as a student is a big part of taking advantage of opportunities. I'm not sure that I reminded myself enough of that. So being a graduate student, getting the training was a huge part of what I did. Everything else was icing on the cake, and it was really important to getting me to having a successful career. But sometimes I think maybe I lost track of that a little bit and didn't really fully get what I could have potentially out of my program. And then I think, prioritizing things and making choices is not an option to deliver on commitments. So, it's great to have this commitment mindset and to say that you're never going to let people down and your word is your word. But you have to think about the opportunities you're taking, because if you take too many things on, you can't really deliver them. So I think, first generation students in particular need some coaching in this space to understand that. My wife and I talk a lot at home about things that we're taking on, things we're saying yes and no to. So my kids see this every day, but this is not something that, having a 9-to-5 parent working, that kids see a lot of, or you have that experience as a first generation college student. The other thing that I think sometimes happens is that it seems like first generation college students may not ask for help or don't really take feedback. And I've often seen as I'm a creative problem solver who's had to identify their own solutions. So there have been a lot of situations in my life that I don't really know how to handle. And in those situations, I haven't always had people to ask questions over or to give guidance. So I'm very self-reliant on trying to come up with solutions, and I'm pretty good at it. Although sometimes the solutions I come up with are way more convoluted than they have to be. But that's really been my view on things. And so sometimes when I'm given a task, particularly in grad school, I didn't always do it in a way that made sense or was the most, straightforward way of doing it. I was thinking of an example where I was asked to do some analyses for a paper, and I learned that by doing some background work, that analysis wasn't really in vogue anymore, and there were new, more sophisticated, but also more complicated ways of doing it. And I kind of took that on myself and did it in a different way and made it more complex and a lot more difficult than it would have been. And ultimately it worked out because my advisor was really appreciative of it and we had space and time to get to work on that paper. But, there are times when you're asked to do something, and I had this experience with a student right now who's kind of on a clock and, doing a lot of things, and a lot of really creative, interesting things, but I feel like is not helping herself because she's making things more complicated than they have to be. So I think this idea of working on, a long project, iterating across time is not something maybe comes natural or is well understood among first generation college students. So, I think it's really important to think about framing work as iterative, as longitudinal, as collaborative, making sure that students understand that, they need to check in. They don't have to solve problems entirely among themselves. They have people to rely on that way. And the other thing too is I think I often tell my students, particularly my first generation students, that I want you to be creative here, and that's what I'm asking you for, or I don't want you to be creative. I want you to do what I'm asking, and really to help them understand what they're trying to accomplish that way and rein some of that in. And the last thing I'll say, which is pretty quick, is that I think that some people think that first generation college students might lack awareness or be a little awkward. I've always saw myself as very self-aware, but I'm not always sure how to act on it or say it. And I think that it's important to know that people who grow up in environments where they don't see a lot of professionals, we don't really have a lot of experience seeing people disagree in a meaningful or in a respectful way, or having healthy conversations about different viewpoints. Some of us come from very polite environments where that's not necessarily something that's even a good thing. But we all know that to succeed as a professional, you have to be able to have these kinds of conversations and to be thoughtful and respectfully disagreeable at times. So I think that's something that's always been challenging for me. I found very stressful and had a really hard time articulating even, very low stakes kind of critique. So I think giving people like chances to synthesize, communicate information, take it from up here and spit it out because they're not used to doing that, to have them get comfortable with giving critiques is really important for the development of professionals who hadn't had maybe that experience. And I think doing things like giving them leadership opportunities, helping them oversee students or someone in other positions are really helpful too. A lot of just getting out of their head and having them experience communicating that and relating that to others. So yeah, those are just a few things that I came up with in thinking about this talk. I just want to say thank you again. I think what you're doing simply to raise awareness is really important in of itself. And so I really appreciate that. I'm always happy to chat if anybody has any questions. And I just want to thank my mentors at Penn State and beyond, all my staff and students who are first generation college students. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Dr. Stapleton, thank you. Wow, that was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And I wish, we had more time in this session, but we're going to be transitioning pretty soon. And I know that you have so graciously offered additional time to go into the next session for a debrief in a Zoom meeting room. So for those of you joining us who would like to have more of an intimate conversation with Dr. Stapleton to follow up on all that he has inspired through his keynote presentation, please join us for that session. Just a few things I want to call out as we wrap up here. I love how you broke this down and really explained your experience and what you see, because a lot of what you offered and what you see, how you think others may perceive you and what you feel resonated with me too. And I think it probably resonated with a lot of other folks who identify as first gen, as I do as well. And so I want to thank you for really thinking about it from that angle and speaking from your personal experience. I also really love this, emphasis and the tip you gave about providing additional opportunities for first generation students in a low stake, safe environment. And I think that's something that we can all be thinking about in our own work of how we are doing that and providing those crucial and critical opportunities. Great. So we've got some questions that had come in. Some folks in the audience want to know a little bit more about your experience and your support systems pre-college. There's, just what do you think about just your opinion on the biggest barriers involving getting students engaged in extracurriculars? So I'm going to entice folks to transition over to the debrief where they can get all of those questions answered and more. Thank you so much for your time and for your presentation today. And everyone, please, again, remember to fill out those session evaluations to provide us feedback. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of the summit.